The Resident Evil game that can't be remade by IGN.
With Resident Evil 4's release last year, Capcom's project to remake the glory years of its survival horror series is complete. But as the game's post-credit scene suggests, the remakes aren't over. And so the big question is, where next? The obvious answer is a remake of Resident Evil 5.
Good God, what are you playing this on? Why does that look locked to 30 FPS?
But on the game's 15th anniversary, it's clear that moving forward chronologically will take Capcom's remakes into the series' weakest era. An era.
Turn down your volume. I don't know who did the mixing on this. This audio is very, very loud for the base video, so I would turn your audio down a little bit as a warning.
Of gameplay and narrative decisions best left in the past. Resident Evil 5 simply can't be remade, at least not to the standards of Capcom's best work. And so the answer is not to remake, but to rewrite.
Really? This is a bold comment to make. As somebody that has several hundred hours in Resident Evil 4 across Xbox 360, Nintendo Switch, Xbox One, PC, I think I have a little bit of authority to talk on the game, at least in a little capacity, right? That is a bold claim to make right out the gate. It'll generate clickbait. Clearly, we're here discussing this. This is a really interesting take.
Resident Evil is a survival horror series. Not that you'd know that playing Resident Evil 5. Sure, it features a constant flow of horrific imagery, but Resident Evil 5 is an action game through and through. That's evident in its cover shooter mechanics, vehicle chases with on-rails turret sequences, and the constant rattle of assault rifles. Even its visual design evokes the sandy shades of modern military games that experienced mass popularity in the late 2000s.
MW2.
It all speaks to a series that had lost its way. Rather than reflect on the tenets that were the foundation of its experience, Resident Evil 5 looked to the contemporary gaming zeitgeist in an attempt to find a new lease of life.
I have gone on record before saying, yeah, this is very Army of Two at the time, right? Resident Evil 5 is an action game, but to call Resident Evil 4 a horror game, I feel, is disingenuous. Resident Evil 4, much like Dead Space, is a thriller game. The differentiation between thriller and horror, to me, can you fight back, or can you fight back effectively? Something like, what is it, Fear 1? That's going to be horror. Something like Alien Isolation. That's going to be horror. Something like Outlast. That will be horror. Something like Resident Evil 4, which, yeah, it can be hard on hardcore, don't get me wrong. That's a thriller game. Something like Dead Space 1. That is a thriller game. Yes, there are body horror elements to it. There are necromorphs. There's the corruption. There's insane people everywhere, right, from the Marker's influence. But that is a thriller game. You are effectively going through a haunted house with the ability to punch and stomp things, right? Now, Dead Space 2, that's an action game. Dead Space 3 is a kind of co-op action game, not dissimilar to Resident Evil 5. I actually don't dislike Resident Evil 5. I think Resident Evil 5 is a competent game. I think it tells a different story. You are the BSAA. You are the... Look at this man. Look at Chris's muscles. Chris's muscles are down, I think, 60% from what base was, if I understand it correctly. They got toned down for the final release, right? Also, this quality has kind of thrown me for a loop. I don't know what they recorded on. And you are playing the Macho Man tag team action hero game. That's what you're playing. That's like me being mad at Dead Space 2 for being an action game. It's literally an action game. Like, what do you want from me? Like, it's like going to Wendy's and complaining that they have burgers. Like, you're signing up for this. But I agree. From the prior Resident Evils going into RE5, it is a departure. And then Resident Evil 6, I like it. It has its own issues. I acknowledge it has its own issues, but that's one of those things that I could just go, look, I also like games like Majora's Mask, right? Like, I like weird things. I like Halo 5 Guardians. I like weird things. So I understand the cases against it, but I think that when I look at it as this is a co-op drop-in, drop-out third-person action game, kind of a good game. Maybe not a good Resident Evil game, but kind of a good game.
The result is an unholy hybrid of Resident Evil, Gears of War, and Call of Duty. It's as ugly and unwieldy as it sounds.
Okay, I know that they're throwing JJ in there. I do think that this take is disingenuous. I do think that this is not entirely correct, if that makes sense. Now, if you had shown maybe the stealth bomber sequence, maybe that would have been a better background. You know, kind of James Bond, Call of Duty kind of thing, right? But We literally had this exact enemy, JJ, in Resident Evil 4. He was on the island. He's actually absent for the remake. He's actually absent, mind you. But we did have it in RE4. I don't think that's entirely proper to showcase JJ as an enemy when he's clearly in RE4 as well. I don't think that's a fair thing to showcase as a point, as a talking point in your presentation. I don't think that's correct.
This design appears to not just be a misguided attempt to follow Western successes, but also a misreading of its predecessor. With Resident Evil 4, director Shinji Mikami deftly reinvented the series through the use of a new over-the-shoulder camera angle.
Right.
The perspective allowed for a more kinetic, action-heavy game. Despite this, Mikami never lost sight of the terror at the core of Resident Evil. Through the use of enemies that were strategically placed to provide undulating waves of tension and fear, and the inclusion of Ashley as your vulnerable charge, combat encounters were focused on surviving overwhelming horrors rather than dominating foes. Resident Evil 5, meanwhile, presents its enemies as waves to be gunned down with increasingly powerful weaponry.
I don't think that's entirely correct either, though. You know what a Duvalia is? I think it starts on 3-1 when you first enter the swamp. And I think it's in the top right corner of the map. So the northeast corner of the map, where you have to go get one of the idols. You have to have Sheva partner jump up there. And you come back out, and there's a Magini that runs at you, a swamp Magini. And you pop him, and his upper half explodes into this weird, like, shell kind of thing. And he's got this little gaping mouth at the center. And his shell closes in on him. And it's damn near invincible. You have to kind of hit the rib cage hanging off, or God forbid the legs, if you can hit the legs, because there's a similar Duvalia at the end on the ship that has armored legs. If we're going to talk about enemy design, let's have this discussion, IGN. I'm absolutely here to have this discussion. If you're saying that they're waves to just be gunned down, okay, maybe that could be said for, say, I don't know, the Reapers, the giant insect and like the giant cricket ones that can insta-kill you, right? But we had Novistadors in RE4, which filled a similar role, kind of, if that makes sense. They're just more elite Novistadors. I mean, the Cephalo are the exact same thing as the Plaga Type 1 and 2, right? You headshot them, and the giant meaty tendril comes out, right? The thing is that Resident Evil 4 had 3 variants of that. You have the skinny one with the spike, you have the fat one that comes out of the Zealots, right? And then you have the spidery one that can detach itself and roam freely, right? And I think the remake gave these all a glow up. I think the remake actually made them all a lot more threatening. But that's the same enemy design. And so we're talking about how it's not learning from its predecessor, but I'd argue a lot of it is learning from Resident Evil 4. I think that's an incredibly fair thing to say. Not only do we have the Duvali, not only do we have the Cephalo, we have there's a couple others that I'm totally forgetting off the top of my head right now. We already went over JJ. We already covered JJ. Swamp Magini. And yeah, no, like those are made from the way Resident Evil 5 is designed, right? Army of Two style. You're supposed to be my action movie. You're supposed to be gunning them down. You're supposed to be pounding through horde after horde of enemy, right? And that's not a disingenuous thing to say. You just have to understand that's what the game's doing. That's the intent behind it. If you're playing Resident Evil 5 like you're playing something like Resident Evil 2 or Resident Evil 0, you're going to have a bad time. If you play it through the lens of, I'm playing an action Army of Two game, but with body horror, okay, now we're cooking.
Purpose is cannon fodder, a wall of meat to slow your progress through levels. And those levels are not locations to be explored. Instead, they are largely funnels that push...
I can't actually say that on YouTube. I learned through Roanoke Gaming. You cannot say what these enemies are on YouTube. The funny L enemies, the L name, you cannot say that because I guess that's against... YouTube doesn't like that. So fun fact about that. You have these as well. I mean, yeah, they kind of are a little more cannon fodder. I think their HP count is 2,500. I actually have the hardback Resident Evil guide somewhere, that like the actual official book that I can actually look at HP values and stuff on. But like, yeah, no, like this is the quantity of the enemy was more than the quality in most cases in 5. I think you could make a critique on that. I think the quality in 4 was better. This is quantity over quality. I think that's a fair thing to do.
From entrance to exit. Resident Evil 4 may have replaced the series' traditional continuous structure with discrete levels in an attempt to move away from the backtracking heavy design of previous games, but it preserved the spirit of locations like the Raccoon City police station. The village, Salazar's castle, and the island feature interlocking explorable pathways that solidify these locations as authentic spaces rather than obstacle courses. Resident Evil 5 has no interest in this, with the majority of its stages being little more than corridors peppered with dead ends to hide treasures in. Their lack of authenticity means no one will ever mention the Kijuju Autonomous Zone in the same breath as the Spencer Mansion. All this is to say that a faithful remake of Resident Evil 5 would break Capcom's 7-year streak of brilliant survival horror games. It's telling that the series' reset point, Resident Evil 7, was a reinvention of the very first game, a haunted house that grew ever larger as you unlocked new rooms by solving its puzzles. Clever reinventions of this base conceit is the key to Resident Evil's success, be that dropping an unstoppable force into the house's corridors, such as Resident Evil 2's Mr. X, or expanding the scope of the house. Resident Evil Village's titular location is effectively a giant manor. Its corridors are streets, and its rooms are houses. Resident Evil 5's stage-driven structure is simply inferior to this design. A modern recreation of it would only further highlight its flaws, especially coming in such close proximity to masterclasses like the remake of Resident Evil 2.
Okay.
Remakes can, of course, completely redefine the structure of their source material. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, for example, is recognisably an updated version of the classic RPG, but its world design and gameplay mechanics are a world apart from the 1997 original. And so you could argue that Resident Evil 5 is actually the Resident Evil most in need of a remake. A whole new environmental structure and scenario design that reins in the action and dials up the horror would bring it in line with Capcom's other remakes. But all of this doesn't account for Resident Evil 5's most notorious problem. Racism.
What? Okay. I know where he's going with this. This is actually something that I had heard about in passing, and it was actually once upon a time in a roommate situation called out for liking Resident Evil 5 because it is definitely insensitive. Because what ethnicity of people are you ganking the entire game? That's one of those that turns heads, let's put it that way. And I've had people that have heard that, and they've looked at you weird, and you have one half of people that look at you weird, like, what are you smoking? And you have the other half of people that go, yeah, that makes sense. But generally, I think people look at this and go, excuse you? We also do have enemies that are... Trying to find, how do I say this on Twitch? We have enemies that are white in Resident Evil 5. Look at the dude with the mustache and the black hair, right? It's not specifically one group of people. Also, I mean, I don't know. Let me hear the reasoning for this. Let me hear this. Present me this in a educated fashion, IGN.
Set in a fictional West African country, Resident Evil 5
Damn, look at that guy right there on the right.
Its primary antagonists are black people. Yes, it's technically the Ouroboros virus that protagonist Chris Redfield is fighting. But the parasite's host is depicted as a nation of mobs and primitives who are violent even before their infection.
No, wait. No. Okay, that's period, end sentence. Let me hear that again.
It's technically the Ouroboros virus that protagonist Chris Redfield is fighting.
Incorrect. That is a Plaga Type 2. Las Plagas from Resident Evil 4, it is the Type 2 version of that. The Plaga Type 1 had to be eggs injected and they had to grow, right? That was the point of Resident Evil 4, is that it's a race against the clock to save you and Ashley with the funny radiation machine. The Plaga Type 2 were made to be pretty plug-and-play for all intents and purposes to create Magini. That's, yes, you are fighting Irving and trying to get to the bottom of the Ouroboros project, and you fight the three Ouroboros, technically four if you count Wesker at the end, right? The three Ouroboros bosses, right, throughout the game. But there are only 3 Ouroboros enemies, and they're all relegated to boss status. You are fighting Plaga. That's why they are controlled in the way they... I don't think that's... What I say about you have one shot when you make a video to say something, and even if you redact it, I don't I don't. This is a hard pill for me to swallow because that borders on that's disinformation. It's misinformation, borders on disinformation. This person probably had to get this out in a week or something like that and just went through and it's like, okay, from my inferring of playing through this game in my capacity, this is what this sounded like. I'm going to discredit this talking point because you are fighting BOWs, generally the Plaga Type 2, with a few Ouroboros enemies in the game.
But the parasite's host is depicted as a nation of
It's not even a parasite. I'm sorry, it's not even a parasite. The Ouroboros is a virus. That is blatant disinformation now. That's not how that works. The Ouroboros was a virus. You can't tell me that they put this out without doing at least a basic level of research. It even says Ouroboros virus on like the final 2 missions, right? You go into the what's a good one? Ouroboros will be released in the atmosphere. Albert Wesker says it aboard the plane, right? Aboard the stealth bomber. Wow. It's almost like, can parasites be released in aerosol spore? I mean, probably some of them, maybe. But like, I guess technically something like, well, cordyceps is a fungus. That's different. But you see how like this doesn't, basic research, basic Googling could fix this.
That protagonist Chris Redfield is fighting. But the parasite's host is depicted as a nation of mobs and primitives who are violent even before their infection. Intentionally or not, Resident Evil 5 positioned Africa as the Dark Continent, an uncivilized world harboring a diseased population that needs gunning down via Western intervention in the name of global security. This insensitive treatment of people of colour was hotly debated even as early as Resident Evil 5's debut trailer, with writers such as Ngai Kroll and Stephen Totillo pointing out the game's uncomfortable post-colonial imagery. The arguments and think pieces continued well into the game's release window, with IGN's own former editor-in-chief Hilary Goldstein having also wrestled with the subject. But that was 2009, a time when race was apparently a debate rather than a reality.
So how do you fix this, right? How do you fix this? And that's the thing. So where you're going in Africa, where you're going to Kijuju isn't, it's how do I word it? It's a rundown town. You got smugglers going through, smuggling BOWs. We literally go here to find Irving, right? Like, if you wanted to address this, okay, you make something more akin to, I guess, South Africa, maybe. Like the way I always do it, you're not going to a good part of Africa in this. You're not going to a good part where Kijuju is. That always made sense to me, at least. But if you are wanting to skirt around the issue, if you're wanting to address this issue, you make it something more akin to modern infrastructure. You make it more akin to, modern cleanliness, stuff like that. You make it less akin to the way you see Kijuju, animals lying around. But even then, right? Imagine, this treats rural Spaniards very poorly to have Valdalobos have a horrible looking crucifix with the police officer burned on, right? Okay, but you're going to this backwater Spanish town with a bug cult. What are you expecting? Like what did you expect? Right? And that's where you're complaining about the action-isms and not having enough horror, but you look at some of the horror elements that introduces, like animal carcasses everywhere, things strung up, bodies strung up, the executioner Magini's mount, right? And I guess you're not really taking that into consideration. So yeah, just modernize the city. Maybe you go through a section like this, like you're seeing here, and it happens to be, I don't know, the slums, right? But then you just move on with it. You also, I guess, if you really wanted to have more of a diversity of skin colors in there, yeah, I don't. This is a weird one for me. I'm going to be completely honest. Like, this makes me feel weird.
In the 2020s, in a post-Black Lives Matter world, there is only one acceptable response to a white man shooting waves of Africans for an entire video game.
What?
No.
There's one thing I do know. I have a job to do, and I'm gonna see it through.
Remakes may be able to redefine their source material, but there's
Okay.
only so many changes you can make.
You're just gonna blow past that. That's weird. But you see how now people are already in the chat are already kind of discrediting this piece because it got political, right? You wonder why I don't like dealing with that type of stuff. You don't why I don't deal with that, if that makes sense. I try not to, because this video will be polarizing whether IGN wanted it to be or not. This will be a polarizing stance. I think, like South Africa as a setting, like Chad is also corroborating, would probably be better. You have a mix of, for all intents and purposes, quote unquote, of zombie enemies. Zombie, quote unquote, right? Just mind controlled ploggerbearers. Yeah, it is also, yes, a remake. Remake does not equal remaster. So if you remake it, wink, wink, you can adjust anything in the setting you need to adjust it and run it by whatever board, whatever sensors you need to. It's almost like it gives you a do-over for if something, maybe you wanted to change something, or maybe you thought something didn't go well, right? You have things like the Resident Evil 4 remake, where I think the parry system is the best thing they've added. You have things like the Majora's Mask remake, Majora's Mask 3D, which completely nerfed the Deku Link speed momentum and Zora swimming, right? Because it has to use MP at that point. It could be good or bad, but it allows you to change your source material.
Until it's not a remake at all, but an entirely new game. And if you take Africa out of Resident Evil 5, is it Resident Evil 5 anymore? Even with a vastly improved, more sensitive take on the continent, perhaps one with a black protagonist and a more empathetic look at the outbreak, the experience would simply be too divorced from the original to hold the name Resident Evil 5.
Did we just insinuate Sheva's not black? Bro, this video's getting really weird. Like I feel like I'm just elevated on something at this point. They showed. No, okay, I'm not tripping, homie.
Sensitive take on the continent, perhaps one with a black protagonist.
What? Bro, she's fucking right there. What are you talking about? Unless I'm just missing something. What? This even references Sheva as a character.
And a more empathetic look at the outbreak, the experience would simply be too divorced from the original to hold the name Resident Evil 5.
Hold up, right there.
The experience
Dude in striped shirt. Dude holding Sheva. What are they?
would simply be too divorced from the original to hold the name Resident Evil 5.
Bro, you're deconstructing your own arguments with your own footage. What is happening here? I went into this to look for an analysis of like, oh yeah, well, this is why it couldn't be right. Because if you actually take this and you do this, okay, then logically this would make sense. This is some... Bro, we're on something tonight.
So where does Capcom go now? Personally, I'd look backwards. Code Veronica is an ideal candidate, as is the original Resident Evil. But if the only way is chronologically forward, then a total rewrite of what comes next is the logical path. Because what followed Resident Evil 4 was not one terrible game, but two. Resident Evil 6 tripled down on the action-packed, set-piece heavy shooter design.
So that's the thing. If you're going to claim Resident Evil 5 is racist, like you can also claim Resident Evil 6 is racist because, oh damn, you're in China. Like, you see how this just gets into weird territories that you've now opened yourself up to? Whoa. Whoa, bro. And I'm not saying that they're perfect 10 out of 10 games by any means. Sheva is a playable character, so there's not even a devil's advocate there. Looking at chat, right? There's not even a devil's advocate there. Sheva is playable. In fact, I played Sheva on the 360 more than Chris.
To the extent that much of it could be mistaken for a third-person Call of Duty spin-off were it not for the monsters. Its restrictive level design practically puts you in a chokehold, forcing you to endure a barrage of bombastic moments that have no interest in evoking any sense of fear.
Yeah.
Resident Evil 6 is a survival horror, only in that it's a horrible game that you have to survive playing. But this time around, it doesn't have to be like that. Capcom now has the opportunity to ignore the past and completely reinvent this chunk of the timeline. In Resident Evil 4 Remake's post-credit scene, evil mastermind Albert Wesker details his plans for world domination to Ada Wong. Reflected in his glasses is an image of Excella Gion and the Stairway of the Sun.
Yeah, like we have that in 4. We have 5 references at the end of 4, and then Ada flies off, and we even have a Krauser. We see that his body at the end of Separate Ways, Wesker recovered his body. So we can have Krauser being the patient zero, so to speak, of certain things in his own right. Yeah, it's almost like they're rewriting things. It's almost like they've been doing this since Resident Evil 2 remake, right? Wow. What a concept that a remake is going to redo some plot points. Like, let's look at Resident Evil 2, Birkin, right? What was Birkin's Form 4 as G-Virus? G-Virus Stage 4. In the original, it was more dog-like. In the remake, it was more, I think it went back to bipedal and had some kind of wings. And then Stage 5 was just kind of the Googlob, right, on the train. Like, yeah, that's a rewrite. You're rewriting it. You're remaking it. You have a chance to do it over. You can't address Resident Evil 5 as a game that can't be remade and then say, well, but Resident Evil 4 got remade and it was fine, and we just excuse Resident Evil 2 and Resident Evil 3 as a remake. People actually have contention over Resident Evil 3 as a remake for a lot of reasons.
Significant plot elements from Resident Evil 5, which indicates Capcom's intentions. But there's more to consider. This scene is largely a replication of the sequence from Assignment Ada, a non-canon chapter from the original Resident Evil 4. Its shift from unofficial to canon points to a willingness to change. Furthermore, the end of this scene is completely rewritten. When learning of Wesker's plans, rather than dutifully deliver the stolen Las Plagas sample to him, Ada betrays her shadowy boss and forces her helicopter to turn around. In this moment, the future of Resident Evil becomes unclear. Capcom has given itself the freedom to do whatever it wants.
Okay.
I just hope it's not a remake of Resident Evil 5. For more on how
Once again,
with Resident
I'm not even going to finish that out. He was done with his talking point when I accidentally clicked the end card. Do you know how numbers work, bro? What comes after 4? Like, do you want, like, Resident Evil Infinite? Resident Evil Guardians? Like, what's the intent here? I think a 5 remake could go fairly well. Like, this video made my head hurt, if I'm going to be completely honest. After 4 or 6. My bad, chat. Like, no, and I guess from what it sounds like, chat caught on that they were using remake and remaster interchangeably. They are not the same thing. A remake is not a remaster. A remaster is not a remake. The Dead Space remake changes lore, right? We got to know who the patient was for the hunter, right? We got characterization. We had the plot point of Nicole being what's her face, right? And that was a twist that we didn't have in the original, right? It allows you to redo certain things. I think the African setting is fine. Just make it a mixed diversity setting. Grats, you're fucking done. Call it a day. Go to lunch, right? I think that this, unfortunately, was a video to push a point and to be divisive for the sake of being divisive. I'd be very curious in the comment section down below what the like to dislike ratio is. Comments are still on, which boggles me. For 18.1 million subscribers to have 239,000. Look, here it is. Big Cherry comments, as a native Nigerian, y'all really got to stop being offended for us. We're crying this on a bunch of Spaniards. We're getting Rari 4 remake. Oh, right here. 2,600 likes, which has gone a little up. 22,000 dislikes. That is a factor of 10. Like, if you really are concerned, then yeah, just change it to a more ethno-diverse setting. But, I mean, also, cool, as a native Nigerian, come on now, bro, right? I'm going to defer to the dude that apparently lives in Nigeria. Cool. Whatever. Go for it. And that's really what it comes down to. Oh, Kip, what about the whole Latinx thing? Look, I'm not Latina. I'm not Latino. I'm not Spanish, right? I'm using, like, actual, like, Spain. I'm not any of that, right? Well, I guess, technically. You know what I'm saying, right? I'm not of origin to really have that debate. Everyone I have heard talk about Latinx has talked about it negatively and said not to do it. Especially friends I have who are Mexican. People I know who are Latino. They don't like it. So, what do? I just don't use it. I just say, look, cool. Thanks for educating me. I won't use it. And I've never used it. Hot damn. It's that fucking simple. Clearly, this is also an L from IGN as 2,656 likes to a factor of 10 dislikes. clearly this is a pretty L take. If you're wanting could they remake Resident Evil 5? Well, absolutely. I mean, let's add something constructive here. They could absolutely remake this. You know, you could have a different intro sequence, and you could have a whole intro sequence about Jill, even Sheva, her history with Kajuju, kind of characterize her a little more. If you want to have the co-op in, you can. If you don't want to have the co-op, you can absolutely do stuff like that. You might even be able to swap missions between characters. I think that would lean a little too heavy to the action, though, unless you do it in some really like horror haunted house setting. If you are wanting to change it up a little bit, I think Resident Evil 4 Remake had a lot of enemies. They combined the quantity and the quality of enemies. So I think you can absolutely redo that. You can absolutely have that and bring it into the modern setting. And then you have, things that maybe happen from Krauser. You have an enemy that, starts having blade arms or something like that. And, that's Krauser, right? And you can make that connection from 4 to 5. And the fact that they changed Resident Evil 4 Remake's ending in the way that they did with Ada going off in the other direction allows them to have so much creative freedom. And if anything, I think it's a beautiful ending sequence to see Extelligione and to see the Stairway to the Sun with the progenitor flowers, right? And you can see, oh, hey, Resident Evil 5, right? You have it right there. And then Ada says, nah, we're going this way. Isn't that almost poetic to say, we're going to take this in a new direction, right? We're going to take this second chance and we're going to run with it. We're going to do our own thing with this, right? So I think pretty L take, personally. I think that IGN, overreached here. I think this is a pretty big L. And, I'm not anyone that's sponsoring this. I can see 5 products. I don't really want to engage with any of these products, if I'm being completely honest. And I don't know if this is this dude, whoever's narrating this. It probably isn't his view. He's probably just handed the script, hey, read this. So I don't think even really calling him out as anything. Now, this is a weird one. This is a big fat IGNL. Let me know your comments in the description, comment section down below, and I'll see you all in the next one.